And next, we are honored to have Dr. Katrin Luger, Chief of the Transport Research and Policy Section at UNESCAP with us. Dr. Luger will be addressing us on the case for transport decarbonization, leveraging rail and technologies. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Luger.
Your Excellency, Dr. Chayatan from SON, Your Excellency Kun Sani Lerpiantam, Professor Chochai Chornam, distinguished speakers, delegates, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning, and a very warm thank you from my side to the organizers, RTRDA, TRRN, and BEM, for having me here today. It is an absolute pleasure to have the chance to address such a distinguished group of people, and I would like to congratulate you on organizing this very interesting conference. I'm here today to try and set the scene for the discussions and site visits you will do over the next 3 days, and to talk a little bit about how rail and technology, how academia and private industry that are gathered here today in this room fit into the global agenda. As the moderators have kindly said during their introductions, I work for the United Nations ESCAP. For those of you who don't know, ESCAP is the Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific, and it is one of the 5 regional commissions of the United Nations Secretariat, headquartered right here in Bangkok. Just like many private organizations, the UN Secretariat is organized along regions in the world to make it a little easier to work. We represent 53 member states and about 40% of the world land area and more than half of the global population. And if you see the little map here, you will notice that it is a very vast region and very diverse. We cover everything from Turkey all the way to the Pacific Islands, and we cover countries that are highly developed first world countries all the way to least developed countries in dire need of assistance. So what do we do? What is our work? And how does it relate to what we're trying to achieve here today? So ESCAP has a number of mandates. First and foremost is obviously that we assist our member states in supporting the delivery of the Agenda 2030, which consists of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, which I sincerely hope everybody in this room has heard about. And we support member states in delivering on the commitments they have taken under this Agenda 2030 in order to foster sustainable development. We provide a strong regional voice. As I mentioned, we represent 60% of the world's population, and as that, we have the unique challenge of trying to build a platform that represents the interests and priorities of this very diverse group of member states. We are the most inclusive intergovernmental platform, so if intergovernmental agreements come together, they turn into binding law, and it is something that member states take a commitment to follow. We enhance cooperation between member states, and we provide extensive technical and capacity building support for sustainable development. And last but not least, we also bridge between member states and development funding. Let me give you a very simple example. If you are a city somewhere and you want to build a metro network and you want the World Bank or the Asian Development Bank to finance it, normally you turn to ESCAP first. We help you to define the project, to make it bankable, and then we make the link to the funding institutions. Dr. Chayatan has talked a lot about green energy and green transportation, and I want to talk a little bit about climate action because it is critical for our future. You have a quote here from UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, and the quote is actually not complete. The full quote reads, "If we do not act now, the 2030 agenda could become an epitaph for a world that might have been." So I think you can see that he's really sounding the alarm bells. And the question is, why do we need to talk about climate action? Well, let me give you a few numbers. We have 2 million lives lost to climate-induced disasters in this region right here in Asia and the Pacific since 1970. And that is more than in the rest of the world combined. In other words, Asia Pacific is by far the most climate-induced disaster region in the world. We have also about $1 trillion, or almost 3% of regional GDP, that's been lost to the economies due to climate disasters and related results. And finally, I have another number for you. I think that's quite sobering. If we want to meet our climate objectives that have been set out by 195 nations in the Paris Agreement, we need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 50%, and not in 2050, but in 2030. In other words, we have 7 short years in order to cut our greenhouse gas emissions in half. So if anybody here in this room had a doubt as to why we need a rail conference, I think the answer is right here. So this conference is timely, this conference is relevant, and I'm absolutely pleased that we have the opportunity to talk about this here today. So why are we talking about transport in this context? Well, transport decarbonization is one of the key prerequisites in order to deliver on our climate objectives. I'm sure you are familiar with the Paris Agreement, which was adopted by 195 nations in 2015, with the commitment to limit the rise of global temperatures to 1.5 degrees compared to pre-industrial levels by 2050, and to get to net carbon zero emissions in 2050. Without transport, this objective will be firmly out of reach. Transport accounts globally for roughly 1/4 of greenhouse gas emissions. In other words, every 4th ton of CO2 that is emitted globally comes from the sector that we all work in. To make things even more realistic or sobering, if you wish, transport emissions would have to decline by about 3% every year in order to deliver on the Paris commitments, when in reality, since 1990, so over the last more than 30 years, they have been growing by 2% per year. Honestly, it's not a surprise, because as Dr. Chayatan has also explained, transport of passengers and goods is a driver for economic growth and development, which all nations want, right? However, transport is catastrophically off track to meet its climate commitments, and we have the unique challenge in front of us of having to decarbonize the transport sector without choking or jeopardizing economic growth and development. And you see on the graph here that I thought is really powerful. With the current trajectory that the transport emissions are on, we will be very far away from reaching our climate commitments. Even if we go with the yellow line, which is called ambitious policies, which mainly summarizes current commitments from our member states, from the national governments of Asia Pacific, plus measures on top that haven't even been adopted, but that are available, such as carbon pricing, investments in rail infrastructure, decarbonization of energy for electric mobility, reduction in business and long-distance trips. If we do all that, which is already a very ambitious program, we will still not be able to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to the level needed in order to avoid global climate disaster. You can see the green line allows us just about under 0.7 gigatons of CO2 in 2050, which would be needed in order to deliver on the commitments of the Paris Agreement. So how does ESCAP contribute to this climate action? We provide a regional cooperation platform for our member states in order to implement their low-carbon policies, and we provide extensive technical advisory and capacity building in order to allow our member states to take more ambitious policies on low-carbon transport, and I think it's been coming through very clearly through the speech of Dr. Chayatan this morning. Thailand is a very strong partner, and it's an absolute pleasure to work on this together. One other example is we have a very strong interest from member states on transitioning to electric mobility. We're currently supporting 15 countries with their national electric mobility plans. But mind you, to all the rail professionals here in this room, normally the first order of business when you talk about electric mobility is not rail, it is electric buses. So I think rail really has a way to go, and I'm happy that we have a chance to talk about this here. So what is it about rail? I think we can all agree that from an emissions point of view, rail is certainly the best choice for both passengers and freight. If you compare rail with road, for instance, in the graph that you see on your left, both for freight and passenger, rail is 5 to 6 times cleaner in terms of greenhouse gas emissions compared to road. However, the modal share of rail is catastrophically underrepresented. It's only about 25% of goods that are being transported by rail globally. And if you look into the passenger side, it's even more challenging. Only every 10th passenger kilometer that is traveled worldwide is traveled on rail. So I want to take this opportunity, since we're here at a technology conference, to talk about digital technology for a moment. If we want that modal share or that modal shift to finally happen, digital technology is certainly an enabler that we cannot overlook because it will help us to increase rail efficiency, sustainability, and competitiveness. So I want to take a moment to talk about these 3 points that you see here. So let's talk about rail freight. And we've heard this morning from Dr. Chayatan about the ambitions of Thailand for the modal shift from road to rail, in particular for freight, and there's really no time to lose. What you see here is the share of goods and freight transported by rail on the red line in the graph, not the red line in Bangkok, and you can see that the picture really isn't pretty. In the 1970s, 60% of goods transported came by rail, and today that share has dropped to about 24%, and it's obviously been taken away by road infrastructure. Now, road infrastructure investments are not something that the trucking company around the corner can decide. That is public policy making. That's government's decisions, right? So that is why UNESCAP is working very strongly in this space to work on sustainable freight strategies and to convince governments to invest into green transport corridors, into intermodal corridors, into dry ports that allow seamless handling, and to even extend and consolidate the Trans-Asian Railway Network, which I hope many of you are familiar with. But it will need the commitment not only of the member states, but also the support from the industry and the academia in order to provide the solutions that allow us to make this modal shift a reality. So much for the freight side. Let's talk for a moment about passengers. And when I talk about passenger transport, I like to talk about cities. More than half of world population already live in cities, and in a few decades, it will be about 70%. So if we do not solve the transport problem in cities, we will not solve it at all. Now, many member states still struggle with implementing urban rail projects, and I think many of the industry representatives in this room will know that the economics of urban rail are not easy at all. You have large cost overruns, usually due to underestimated construction costs. We did a survey of 58 rail projects in the region, and it was a really staggering number that we saw. The average cost overruns, not the highest one, the average cost overrun for an urban rail project was 45% versus the original baseline. So you can imagine that if you're in private industry, this is really not easy. From an operator point of view, they often struggle with overestimated passenger volumes, which then make the delivery of the operation, a profitable delivery of operation, challenging. You have long implementation times, which is a challenge when it comes to financing the massive capex you have to put up. And all of these challenges result in a certain political bias related to rail transit investments. We also have, obviously, on the policy-making side, still a lot of silo thinking, where agencies do not work together and the institutional capability is limited, and that is particularly where UNESCAP comes in. We provide capacity-building support to our member states to plan sustainable, integrated, and inclusive urban transit projects. We have a few pilots that you can see here. We have an analytical framework for existing rail transport systems to diagnose the maturity and efficiency and then develop targeted plans in order to improve it. For instance, we currently started a 3-year program for 10 cities across our member states to integrate urban planning and transport planning. For me, this is absolutely crucial because if you want to avoid unnecessary trips, if you want to make your trips predictable, as Dr. Chayatan has explained this morning, urban planning and transport planning need to go hand in hand. I fully realize that this is a challenge for existing cities because they haven't been planned that way. But as we plan transport, let's align it with urban sprawl planning and spatial planning as well, and let's make sure we are efficient. Allow me to say a few words on digitalization before I conclude. I think we all know that technology can make rail cleaner, quieter, and safer for passengers, and it can make freight flexible, faster, and cheaper. There are many exciting solutions on the table. We have hydrogen trains being in passenger operation now in Europe. Talk about developments in automated train control, like communications-based train control or a common signaling standard in Europe. So there are solutions there, and in my view, the usage and the leverage of technology is absolutely critical to finally deliver that meaningful modal shift to rail that we all want so much. ESCAP is contributing in any way we can, but we're not a technical organization. So that's why the crowd in this room, I really call upon you to deliver solutions that are competitive, that are accessible, and that help to make rail more efficient. So in conclusion, I would really like to ask all of you to think about how you can contribute to the private industry, try to make rail or work to make rail effective, competitive, accessible. Engage with us. We have a transport research and education network which is open to all academic institutions willing to contribute. We have a sustainable business network which is open to the private sector to work with us. Work with us on knowledge products, help our member states to build their capacity. I see a few people here in the room with which we have already partnerships for joint publications, for training sessions, for joint events. The door is open, and if you have some money left after we've made the solutions really competitive, come and fund a project. I wish the conference the best of success. Thank you so very much for your attention. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you so much. We appreciate your enlightening talk, Dr. Luger, from UNESCAP.